Weak sorcerers don't have a strong sense of self. Across the story of Jujutsu Kaisen, this idea is echoed through several of the strongest and most prominent characters in the story. Each of them have reached a newfound level of power that's derived from a mindset that's completely unorthodox compared to most of their shonen, especially for the story's heroes. However, in Jujutsu Kaisen, reaching this awakened state of mind is rewarded and even treated as the correct state of mind for anyone that's trying to reach the versus pinnacle of power. It's having a strong sense of self and the ability to change your own perception of what you can and can't achieve as a sorcerer to push yourself beyond your current limits. We can see it best in the two strongest sorcerers of JJK, Satoru Gojo and Ryomen Sukuna. While both Gojo and Sukuna reign nearly 1,000 years apart, they both think the same way. Even currently in their fight going on in the manga, they both clearly live and breathe going beyond what anyone thinks is currently possible. If it's repairing a burnt out curse technique or using a domain expansion in a way like never before, Satoru Gojo and Ryomen Sukuna will keep doing the impossible. Even Mei comments that it's almost ridiculous how many times they said something seems impossible, but Gojo and Sukuna do it anyway. They don't see any way to win as an impossibility, and they'll keep trying to overcome the other one way or another. They both have a strong sense of self that's capable of pushing themselves against one another to new heights of power that have never been explored. They're both obviously a catalyst for having the mindset to be a part of the strongest sorcerers in Jujutsu Kaisen. In this video, I'll be explaining how Jujutsu Kaisen's power is to kinda just be selfish by reaching your own sense of self, just like Gojo and Sukuna. If you'd enjoy more JJK content like this, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and comment on some video ideas you want to see be done down below. While having an overwhelming sense of self can make you strong, are you strong enough to play this game from our sponsor, War Thunder? Let's dive into the War Thunder universe where battles are just beginning. Imagine this: historical markings, camouflage, and a truckload of anime skins for your vehicles. Oh, that's the coolest part. Anime voice packs for your crew. Talk about game changer. But wait, there's more. Ever heard of an AH-1S helicopter, Kisarazu? It rocks an authentic JSDF anime design. How epic is that? And here's an exclusive nugget for my anime fans: 3D Dakimakuras. Spice up your tanks with these, available only through my link. Hold up new players, there's a sweet welcome party waiting. With my link, you'll get an extra 7 days of premium account access, a massive 100,000 silver lions, and a booster for extra edge. You can play on PC, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and previous console generations. So ready to conquer the skies and the ground? Join me on the War Thunder adventure. What is a strong sense of self? Throughout the story of JJK, most of the characters who appear on the higher end of power all seem to have one thing in common, and it's that overwhelming sense of self. Like I've mentioned already, it's simply being able to change the way you perceive your own self, to disregard any doubt about your own ability, and no matter who's your opponent, it's trying to win using that sense of self despite the odds that always push sorcerers to greater heights. If we go back to chapter 58 during Megumi's second encounter with the Finger Bearer, this idea couldn't be made more clear. After being knocked out, Megumi in a daze calls back to Gojo's training that he requested after the Goodwill event because Megumi was under the impression that Yuji had actually gapped him, not only in power, but also potential. Gojo reassured Megumi that when it comes to potential, Megumi definitely outclasses Yuji, of course, but what Megumi's missing, which creates the gap between him and Yuji's growth, is just the mental aspect, and what Gojo's talking about is Megumi not having that strong sense of self. Gojo tells him that while Megumi is of course trying to defeat his opponents, he's not trying to bring out his best self because he doesn't know how. Gojo uses the baseball game as an example and questions Megumi's decision to bunt the ball to ensure that Nobara could advance, and he compares Megumi's decision to Yuji. At the end of the day, Megumi's decision to bunt the ball was fine because baseball is a team sport, but when it comes to being a sorcerer, it's not like baseball. Someone like Yuji is always swinging for the fences till the very end, and he also has more endurance than most mentally and physically to keep going to try to win. In the world of Jujutsu, no matter how many allies you have around you, Gojo says you always die alone. Megumi is missing the sense of self to keep pushing himself further, and Gojo says he's underestimating himself instead of picturing a stronger version of his own future. It's because Megumi is too reliant on Maharaga, a Shikigami who's essentially a get-out-of-jail-free card for any scenario at the cost of Megumi's life. Megumi, thinking that in the worst case scenario, he'll always be able to fall back on Maharaga, stopped Megumi from moving forward and gave him a reason not to swing for the fences himself, which is exactly the opposite of Yuji. Gojo says if he keeps thinking like that, thinking without that strong sense of self, he's not going to be able to match up to him or even Nanami. Gojo closes off the conversation by saying that winning by dying and winning even if you die are two completely different things. Winning by dying is giving up yourself to ensure victory but at the cost of your own future, whereas winning even if you die is trying to win for yourself despite the uncertainty, and Gojo tells him to give it his all and think that way because it's okay to be selfish. During Megumi's round 2 against the Finger Bearer, he immediately goes back to try to summon Maharaga, but then he remembers Sukuna. Sukuna had asked Megumi after his escape from the detention facility while he ran. Sukuna couldn't understand why a sorcerer like Megami, a sorcerer with insane potential, didn't use the finger bearer as an opportunity to grow, and he ends up just thinking that Megami's a wasted treasure. Sukuna would have wanted Megami to push beyond his limits because it's situations like those that either make or break a Jujutsu sorcerer, and we see it time and time again. When Megami finally understands both Gojo and Sukuna, he begins taking their advice, and he pictures a stronger version of himself who surpassed his own limitations. Megami puts his hands together, and for the first time, he summons his domain expansion, Chimera Shadow Garden. Megami has gained a sense of self, and he's not just trying to defeat the finger bearer, but he's trying to win and further his own growth ahead of everything else. Even after opening up an incomplete domain, Megami never doubted his own ability to win and only continued to further the interpretation of his power. The narrator comments that a sorcerer's growth is never easy, but having a firm base, skill, and imagination can help a person change thanks to the slightest events. Hidden inventory is another great example. Toji and Gojo are complete opposites, but they both teach us part of the same thing: the importance of having that strong sense of self. Toji is a fighter who's completely unchanged from the world of Jujutsu, a man with no cursed energy. Gojo, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. He's born with the 6 eyes and the limitless curse technique, and he's literally tied to the Jujutsu world by fate. After making it back from the verge of death from his first fight with Toji, Gojo manages to stand up before him and even claim that he feels like he's brand new. Toji lost to Gojo because he deviated from his true self, and he was motivated by wanting to crush the Jujutsu world instead of doing what he truly desired. Gojo, on the other hand, finally began to understand himself. He didn't fight for Shoko or Geto, he simply enjoyed everything in that moment that felt right. It's right then and there that we get the most iconic panel of the manga of Gojo calling himself the Honored One, which, by the way, according to Gege Akutami, the mangaka for JJK, claiming to be the Honored One is a show of arrogance, which is perfectly displaying Gojo's overwhelming sense of self in this moment. Gojo and Toji show us another layer of having a strong sense of self. It's being able to live by your own condition with the freedom to enjoy living as your true self. It's being able to grow without restraint, and it's being able to look at yourself and disregard your own doubt and live in accordance to your own desire. And as a Jujutsu sorcerer, if that means being selfish, so be it. Aside from Satoru Gojo, the only other person in the manga to be called the Honored One is Ryomen Sukuna, who arguably embodies a stronger sense of self than even Gojo himself. In chapter 30, during his encounter with Mahito, the narrator explains that to Sukuna, who lives and dies doesn't really matter. Sukuna exists for his own leisure, and this is reiterated again nearly 200 chapters later. Oro explains to Yuta that he's reaching his limits as a sorcerer, but what lies outside those limits is a being that disregards all else, like a calamity, referring to Sukuna. The idea of missing that sense of self-limiting sorcerers isn't even unheard of, and I've already mentioned already Gojo telling Megami that without the mental aspect, he'd never be able to match up to himself or even Nanami. Sukuna had explained a similar idea to Jogo at the end of their fight, where he tells Jogo about a path to power, but especially a path through having that sense of self. He tells Jogo that humans flocking together and curses flocking together, comparing themselves to those around them, leads to weakness and stunts their growth. Sukuna tells Jogo that he should have burnt everything he desired to a cinder to reach the heights of Satoru Gojo and not worry about his future or identity, but Jogo doesn't have the hunger to take hold of his desires. It's important to note that Sukuna tells Jogo to burn the things he desired in the past tense for things he desires now. Sukuna's drive for power is himself. Again, Sukuna exists for his own leisure, and his true self is disregarding anybody else like a calamity. Not everybody needs to be a selfish psycho necessarily to grow this way as a sorcerer. There's a pretty big misconception in the JJK fandom that simply being selfish alone will make you insanely strong, but this simply isn't true. If being selfish alone made you stronger, then people like Kashima would be at the top of the power system, but there's people like Yuki, Yuta, and Gojo who are all on the special grade caliber without being completely selfish. Like I've mentioned already, it's part of living in according to your own desire. Disregarding all else, including your true goals, isn't what makes you insanely strong. Even Sukuna, who's probably the most extreme example of this mindset, tells Jogo about having the hunger to chase after his own goals. Having a strong sense of self, disregarding your own doubt, and living in according to your true desires doesn't always have to be selfish, but it can be, and if it is, so be it. Another aspect about those who hold this mindset is that eventually they always end up trying to, or just end up changing the world around them. Geto, after chasing his own desires, and as someone someone who told Yuta that there's nothing more important than self-affirmation, tried to completely change the world by getting rid of non-sorcerers. Another example is Maki, who after starting to reach her own sense of self, completely dismantled one of the big 3 Jujutsu families, the Zenin clan, or even Kenjaku, who's literally trying to change the world itself by bringing back the golden age of Jujutsu sorcery, or even Gojo, who wants to reset the entire Jujutsu world in a political sense, and he's already made massive waves of change by using his strength alone. There's many other examples that can be found across the series, but I think you get the idea. Having that strong sense of self and pushing yourself to make those ideals a reality will eventually begin conforming the world around you in accordance with living to what you think feels right and by your own rules. We can see this idea in the hallmark of Jujutsu Kaisen's power system and what Sukuna calls true Jujutsu, domain expansions. According to Kusakabe, domains have parameters, and it's discovering a blend of these parameters or conditions that are needed to establish your own domain expansion. By creating an environment that's almost like another world, by setting up your own conditions, a domain puts the sorcerer at the peak of their power, and domains themselves are considered the peak of Jujutsu. Just like the inside of a domain expansion, when sorcerers live in according to their own conditions, by their own rules, they can change the world around them, and it results in them reaching newfound levels of power. Which is also why I think it's very fitting that Megumi unlocked his domain expansion after reaching his own sense of self. Throughout Jujutsu Kaisen, even the strongest characters in the series are punished or rewarded for giving into this mindset. For example, when Yuki doubted her own ability and relied on Tengen, she lost against Kenjaku's domain expansion. Yuki had doubted her own ability in a domain battle with Kenjaku, and Kenjaku even realized Yuki's reluctance to go into a clash with him, and that's when he chooses to expand the zone. That's not to say if Yuki had expanded her own domain she would have beaten Kenjaku, but it would have given her a better opportunity to overcome and grow like Megumi did against the Finger Bear. Another example is Satoru Gojo, the strongest Jujutsu sorcerer, getting sealed by Kenjaku during the Shibuya incident. When backed into a corner, when restrained not physically but mentally, Gojo was forced to sit and watch. Even someone as strong as Gojo was conflicted because Kenjaku had built a scenario that was perfectly crafted to restrict the strongest in almost every way. What conflicted Gojo was having to make a choice, to either sacrifice the lives of the innocent people in Shibuya to exercise the disaster curses, or to sit back and do nothing instead of possibly ending the lives of innocent people. When left with only one option, Gojo chose to bet on himself. It's then when he opened up his domain for only 0.2 seconds, and he's called the strongest sorcerer alive. Gojo had decided that despite the odds, he was gonna act selfishly and bet on his own ability to win. And that's exactly what makes Gojo the strongest sorcerer in the modern age. It's when Kenjaku actually appears when Gojo is once again frozen in place. While he knew in his soul that Geto was dead and that the sorcerer standing before him was an imposter, Gojo did not immediately dismiss this and attack Kenjaku because he was too focused on what he was seeing rather than what he knew deep down. Nanami makes a comment earlier in the story about how sensing before seeing is standard for one who is capable. Gojo's mistake was letting his sixth eyes go against what his soul already knew deep down. Gojo didn't have a strong enough sense of self to disregard his own doubt and go with his gut, and that's why he was sealed by Kenjaku. There's a little foreshadowing before this of Gojo not knowing about his own identity that conflicts with his strong sense of self, and the most notable examples are Gojo not seeing his own reflection in the eye of the prison realm and Geto's comment at the end of Hidden Inventory, but I'll talk more about that in another video. It's not just Gojo. Finding your own identity and your own true self is one of the main ways of building that strong sense of self. Cursed spirits and sorcerers alike grow massively when they finally understand themselves and their own goals. Mahito, for example, kept growing massively as he further understood his curse technique to gain a greater understanding of his own soul and eventually himself. Don't miss the opportunity. Hit up the link in the description whether you're on PC, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and previous console generations, and snag War Thunder for your gaming device. Using my link guarantees you that special waifu body pillow cosmetic and the fantastic anime crew voices.